Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation that focuses on the Soviet Union's and the PRCs' involvement in the Vietnamese Wars. Something that I think the textbooks don't focus on so much, and so I think this presentation can add a lot to your knowledge of foreign involvement in the Vietnamese Wars. After World War II, the Soviet Union gave little support for communist movements in Vietnam, which was then well outside Moscow's sphere of influence. In any case, Stalin first sought to maintain some kind of working relationship with the West, and when that broke down, was focused on consolidating his hold in Eastern Europe. He also distrusted Asian communist groups, considering them weak and undisciplined, and as much nationalist as communist. By the end of 1949, though, with the Cold War having started, and with Mao's victory in the Chinese Civil War, the situation had radically changed. In January 1950, Moscow belatedly recognized Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh as the official government of Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh went to Moscow to seek Soviet military backing for his war of independence against the French. However, Stalin, whose attentions were still very much concentrated on Europe, didn't want to get involved. Instead, he encouraged Mao to support the Viet Minh. The Chinese had already been cooperating with the Viet Minh. During the Chinese Civil War, Chinese communist forces often retreated into North Vietnam to rest or prepare for further offensives. In return, the Chinese provided the Viet Minh with weapons, munitions, and training. The PRC continued to assist the Viet Minh in the early 1950s, providing significant amounts of military aid to Hanoi, whilst also supplying North Korea during the Korean War. The PRC were giving material support to the North Vietnamese economy too, and had some influence on Vietnamese communist ideology, organisation and policy. PRC advice and technical expertise influenced Hanoi's programs of land reform and industrialisation during the 1950s. And when the Indo-Chinese Communist Party was reformed in early 1951, its structures and organisations were modelled on those of the Chinese Communist Party. The death of Stalin in March 1953 and the stabilisation of the post-World War II division in Europe drew Moscow's attention towards Southeast Asia. But while the Viet Minh were preparing to drive out the French and fight for a unified and independent Vietnam, the Soviet Union preferred a more conciliatory approach. Consequently, Soviet delegates at the Geneva Conference urged the Viet Minh to accept a negotiated peace and the proposed transitional division, and that did include the promise of elections. A divided Vietnam, Soviet strategists argued, would allow for a period of stabilisation. The communist regime in the north would be able to consolidate its power, undertake economic reforms, and improve its military capability. In truth, though, Moscow was concerned that American military involvement in Vietnam would require some kind of Soviet response, which it couldn't afford. So, under pressure from the Soviet Union, Ho Chi Minh advised his representatives in Geneva to sign the accords. Soviet support for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam then remained lukewarm through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. The Soviet Union supplied Hanoi with information, technical advisors and moral support, but Nikita Khrushchev preferred not to get too closely involved. As America increasingly sent advisors and money to South Vietnam, Chinese and Soviet involvement in the DRV also increased. Both the Soviet Union and the PRC lent moral, logistical and military support to the DRV, as Vietnam became, for a time, the centre of the Cold War. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 and the arrival of American combat troops in 1965 triggered an escalation in Chinese support. This came mainly in the form of equipment and construction. In 1965, Beijing sent several thousand engineering troops into North Vietnam to assist in building and repairing roads, railways, airstrips, and critical defence infrastructure. Between 1965 and 1971, more than 320,000 Chinese troops were sent to the DRV. The peak year was in 1967, when there were around 170,000 Chinese there. This enabled a huge amount of North Vietnamese manpower to join the war in direct fighting in the south, and also to repair the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where most of the foreign supply came through. Beijing also supplied Hanoi with large amounts of military equipment, including trucks, tanks and artillery. From 1965 until 1967, over 500,000 guns, more than 4 million rounds of ammunition, 11,000 artillery pieces, and 400,000 artillery shells were sent to North Vietnam by the Chinese. As for the Soviet Union, Khrushchev was removed in October 1964, shortly after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and replaced by Alexei Kosygin, who immediately sent a public message of support to the National Liberation Front and announced a state visit to the DRV in the new year. His visit led to a defence treaty that would provide the DRV with both financial aid and military equipment and advisors. Moscow now became North Vietnam's main benefactor. Like China, the Soviet Union increased its aid to Hanoi after the American military escalation in 1965. The true extent of this support has never been fully disclosed, but it was certainly substantial. In 1966, there were widespread reports that DRV fighter pilots, aircrews, and anti-aircraft gunners had received training in the Soviet Union. It was subsequently revealed that around 3,000 Soviet personnel served in the DRV in 1964-65, and that some were responsible for shooting down American planes. According to some analysts, by the late 1960s, more than 3/4 of the military and technical equipment received by the DRV was coming from the Soviet Union. The Soviets sent MiG fighters, anti-aircraft guns, and surface-to-air missiles. This allowed the North Vietnamese to develop a highly effective air defense system, which by 1967 accounted for the destruction of over 900 American aircraft. To this day, there is much speculation about exactly what was given and by whom. What can safely be assumed is that Soviet and Chinese support was vital to Hanoi, and not only enabled the DRV to keep fighting, but contributed to its success. So I'm sure this presentation will prove useful to you. But in writing this presentation, I came across 2 detailed sources on the web that you might also find useful, and I've included them on this slide. But don't forget, there's my website, History Made Easier, that is hopefully useful for you too. And that I might still have a tutorial slot available if you're interested. But for now, let me thank you for listening and wish you the very best of luck with your studies. Cheers.